This hearing of South Korea's refugee policy in the Yoon administration, a new openness to international standards, is called to order. I'd like to begin by thanking all of our witnesses for joining us today as we look at the Republic of Korea's refugee policy and the new openness which the recently inaugurated administration of President Yoon appears to be signaling. It is appropriate that we hold such a hearing during World Refugee Week when we are reminded of a particular fundamental principle of human rights that those who are persecuted on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion should be able to seek safety and freedom especially among the world's leading democracies. Among those leading democracies is South Korea, which in the course of my own lifetime has emerged from a war-torn nation dependent on foreign assistance to a cultural and economic force to be reckoned with, an influence known as the Korean Wave, or Hallyu in Korean. Culturally, South Korea has had a massive impact on pop music, film, online gaming. South Korea's boy band BTS alone is a global phenomenon, estimated to bring in more than $3.6 billion into the South Korean economy annually. Korean movies have won awards at the Oscars and Cannes Film Festival, while K-dramas have become a pop culture sensation worldwide. And even my wife and I have been enjoying watching a number of these shows on Netflix and elsewhere. Combined with its economic prowess, South Korea has become a soft power leader. However, true soft power and leadership entail more than just leading in terms of economic growth and cultural influence. It is demonstrated, for example, when oppressed people look at a nation as a place of refuge, and that nation responds by embracing the vulnerable, the weak, and the persecuted. Today, South Korea is at a crossroads. In 1982, South Korea acceded to the 1951 Refugee Convention along with its 1967 protocol, and it was also the first Asian nation to enact legislation on refugees. Despite this, it has a very low rate of approval of asylum claims, dipping below 1% in 2020, which marked the lowest figure since the country began to compile relevant data in 1994. Separate and apart from refugees, the number of North Korean escapees reaching South Korea in 2020 also dropped sharply,
This
lower
meeting
than
is
at
being
any time in the
recorded.
previous 2 decades. South Korea's average refugee approval rate for the last 5 years is also less than 1.5%, a striking contrast to Western OECD countries whose acceptance rate in 2020 ranged from a low of 6% in Spain to a high of 74% in Germany, which received over 102,000 applications. The United States, by comparison, accepted 26% of the 87,000 plus applicants. Whether it be a group of Chinese Christians who fled religious persecution, democratic activists who fled a military dictatorship in Burma, or the escapees from the repressive communist regime in North Korea, all share a common desire for safety and freedom. Until recently, South Korea has been ambivalent, if not hostile, to providing a majority of them with such refuge. Indeed, in recent years, it appears to have discouraged even those Koreans who fled the repression of communist North Korea from seeking refuge in the South. Our first witness, Mr. Jung Chul Kim, will provide a very clear-eyed assessment of the obstacles facing refugees in Korea. Against this backdrop, the new administration and President Yoon, who was inaugurated a little over a month ago, has raised expectations that a self-confident Korea is willing to embrace a larger soft power role with regards to refugees. On the campaign trail, then candidate Yoon spoke about the need for, quote, adhering to international refugee protection law and principles. In his inaugural address before the National Assembly in Seoul, he articulated a commitment to, quote, actively protect and promote universal values and international norms that are based in freedom and human rights. He also emphasized Korea's role as global citizens, calling for Korea to assume a greater role, quote unquote, in expanding freedom and human rights, not just for ourselves, but also for others, end quote. With his repeated emphasis on freedom, President Yoon also struck a chord among those who saw the previous administration as being very soft towards Communist North. President Yoon signaled a greater openness towards those who fled communist oppression, seeking a new life in the South. Two of our witnesses, Ethan Shin and Suzanne Schulte, will address the situation of North Korean defectors and the prospects of greater acceptance of them. Interestingly, among those attending President Yoon's inaugural reception were a group of Afghans who had worked alongside Korean doctors in Afghanistan before the country fell to the Taliban. One of our witnesses, Dr. Moon Jun Sun, former head of Korea Hospital in Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, will share his experience working alongside Afghani colleagues and his role in ensuring that they were not left behind when Kabul fell to the Taliban last summer. Under Operation Miracle, South Korea, with the help of the United States, successfully rescued about 400 Afghan colleagues and their family members, taking to heart the principle of, quote, leave no one behind, something I wish our administration had similarly taken to heart as we approach the shameful one-year anniversary from Afghanistan. Interestingly, these Afghans were designated as special contributors rather than refugees, sidestepping and leaving further room for discussion and debate within Korea about refugees. Still, South Korea's willingness to rescue them against all odds, and the subsequent NGO founded explicitly to help resettle Afghan friends in South Korea, is a promising sign of a generous and open Korea. Hence why I perceive that Korea seems to be at a crossroads. Though there is trepidation, there is also a feeling of optimism, nonetheless, that Korea is about to embrace its role as a true global leader and provide an example not just for Asia, but for the rest of the world. With that, I look forward to the testimony and the remarks of my co-chair McGovern, although he has been at a markup of the Rules Committee since 7 o'clock this morning, so I understand he might have some difficulty joining us, at least in the beginning. I'd like to yield to any of our other distinguished colleagues who might be on, who would like to say something this morning. If not, we will go to our distinguished witnesses. I'd like to now introduce our extraordinarily distinguished panel, beginning with Jung Chung Chul Kim, who is the founder and senior researcher at the public interest laws organization called Advocates for Public Interest Law, or APIL. As an attorney and researcher, he has helped to raise an awareness and fought to ensure justice for victims of human rights violations. While his work spans multiple countries and regions, his focus on the Korean Peninsula brings him here today. He cares deeply about the rights and protection of vulnerable migrants in Korea, including refugees, victims of human trafficking, and migrant detainees. A recipient of many awards, including the 2016 Korean Bar Association's Best Public Interest Lawyer Prize and the 2018 State Department's Trafficking in Persons Report Hero Award, Mr. Kim has received international recognition for his work on human rights that he has accomplished in the past several years. Today is his first appearance before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, so let me extend this heartfelt welcome to Mr. Kim. We will then hear from Ethan Hisuk Shin, who is a researcher and legal analyst for the NGO Transitional Justice Working Group, or TJWG, and a lecturer of international law at the Catholic University of Korea. An advocate for South Korea's human rights policy reform, Mr. Shin has helped document enforced disappearances and other human rights violations in South Korea, interview North Korean escapees in South Korea, and create an online database called Footprints to track individuals taken and lost in North Korea. Mr. Shin has also led both domestic and international advocacy, pushing for legislative and legal action to address human rights concerns of North Korean refugees. Again, we're delighted to welcome him, Mr. Shin, to our hearing. We'll then hear from Moon Jun Shun, who is a professor of neurosurgery at Inje University College of Medicine and the director of neuroscience and radiosurgery hybrid research center in Inje University. He is also the former head of Korea Hospital and Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, and has played a pivotal role last year in evacuating Korean allies from Afghanistan when the Taliban took over the country. To support the refugees and migrants settled in Korea, he founded the NGO We All Friends, which provides one-on-one mentorship programs for those struggling to integrate into an unfamiliar environment. Mr. Sun has a long history of leading humanitarian medical aid and projects in developing and crisis countries. We're excited to hear his personal experiences in working with the Afghan refugees and migrants in Korea. So again, welcome, Mr. Sun. And finally, we will hear from Suzanne Schulte, and not finally, but next to last, who is a close friend of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, having testified previously for a number of hearings, including most recently in April 2021, entitled Civil and Political Rights in the Republic of Korea, Implicates for Human Rights on the Peninsula. She is a leading activist in the North Korean human rights movement. She is president of the Defense Forum Foundation, a nonprofit foundation promoting a strong national defense and freedom, democracy, and human rights abroad. Ms. Schulte currently serves as chairman of the North Korea Freedom Coalition, vice co-chair of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, and chair of the Free North Korea Radio. In recognition of her efforts, she was awarded the 2008 Seoul Peace Prize laureate, the 2010 Walter Judd Freedom Award, the 2013 Order of the Diplomatic Services Merit Sung-ni Medal from the Republic of Korea, the 2014 Sanders Peace and Social Justice Award, and a Volunteer Service Gold Award from the President of the United States in 2014. She is also an honorary citizen of Seoul. And I would just point out finally that in the past, it was Suzanne Schulte that introduced me, and then by extension, my Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Human Rights Committee, and this commission, to a number of women who had escaped North Korea and then were trafficked. You know, I am the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I work on the issue of the cruelty of human trafficking each and every day. And when we heard the stories and then had testimony presented by women who had escaped North Korea, in these cases, they got into China and were forced into sex trafficking. And in one case of when a daughter had gone into China, was forcibly put into the slave trade. And then she and her other daughter went looking to try to rescue her, and they were enslaved as well. Well, Suzanne made a huge impact on helping them, and then brought them here to tell their stories of courage. And finally, we have one other witness, I should say, Kenji Kizuka, who is the Associate Director of Research Analyst for Refugee Protection. He supports human rights first policies to promote the protection of refugees, reform U.S. asylum law policies and practices, and bring other U.S. humanitarian immigration policies and practices into line. At Human Rights First, he previously served as senior researchers and policy analyst for the Refugee Protection and Immigrant Justice Corps, Justice Fellow on the Refugee Representation team. He has clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Puller of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second District. He received his Juris Doctor degree, Order of Coif at the UC Berkeley School of Law, and holds a master's degree in public affairs from the School of Public International Affairs at Princeton. He graduated magna cum laude from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and we welcome him as well to the commission. Now, I'd like to begin, if I could, with Mr. Jung Chul Kim. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith and the members of the Commission. Thank you for inviting me as a witness at this hearing. I would like to talk about the evaluation of South Korea's refugee protection policies and expectations under the new administration. South Korea ratified the Refugee Convention in 1992. In 2013, it became the first country in Asia to enact a refugee law. And yet, during the last 30 years, the government has failed to fulfill its obligations of refugee protection. The most significant problem is that the government is generally unwilling to recognize refugees. This country has recognized a total of 1,156 refugees from 1992 to 2012 21. Korea's refugee recognition rate was 1% last year. The country of origin most asylum seekers are coming is China. However, Chinese asylum seekers almost never receive refugee status here. Last 30 years, a total of 7,000 Chinese nationals sought asylum in Korea. Only 11 were recognized as refugees. In 2019, 6 Chinese nationals, including 31 children, came to Jeju Island and applied for refugee status because of religious persecution. I believe there is a reasonable chance they will be persecuted upon returning to China, but the Korean government rejected every one of them. At this point, some are challenging the non recognition in court, others submitted new applications. Sadly, the likelihood of any of them receiving refugee recognition in Korea is virtually zero. To take note, the number of asylum seekers in Korea has been increasing over the years. In response, the Ministry of Justice of Korea implemented a policy of withholding visa from certain asylum seekers in order to deter applications. For example, if an individual entered the country with a 90-day visa and overstayed by even a single day before applying for refugee status, that individual can no longer receive the visa accorded to refugee status applicant. This immigration status is required for employment, which is the only means of survival during the over 4 years that applicants must generally wait to receive the final outcome. Some of Chinese asylum seekers in Jeju Island I mentioned earlier were denied the visa for this reason. While one's application is under review, the chances of de jure deportation to the country of origin are not high, but in reality, many asylum seekers live under the threat of de facto deportation. This is because many are deprived of their means of survival during the lengthy refugee status determination process. According to the Refugee Act, for the first 6 months, refugee status applicants can receive assistance for living expenses and reside in a reception center. After that, they can receive work permits and seek employment. Nevertheless, because of the budget shortfall, asylum seekers rarely benefit from this assistance. For example, last year, only 43 individuals were able to receive the financial assistance, and only 22 were able to stay in a reception center. Against this backdrop, employment is really the only means of survival for most asylum seekers. And yet, as mentioned before, some asylum seekers are not able to get the visa required for a work permit, meaning they have no legal way to survive. When immigration officers find an asylum seeker working as an employee without the visa, that individual is placed in a prison like immigration detention facility. To make matters worse, the relevant immigration law allows for indefinite detention without any periodic judicial review. Moreover, While the Refugee Convention provides that recognized refugees should be given the same treatment as is accorded to nationals in terms of social welfare, the Korean government has been reluctant to implement the provision. A more fundamental issue is that most recognized refugees cannot meet the income threshold for permanent residency. To become a permanent resident in Korea, non-citizens, including recognized refugees, must earn an income greater than the previous year's gross national income per capita. Most recognized refugees cannot satisfy this requirement since they end up having unskilled, lowest paying jobs because their educations and vocational careers in the country of origin are never properly recognized here in Korea. Since 2015, Korea has been resettling about 30 refugees each year. But as I mentioned, it recently resettled 391 Afghan nationals last August. These are people who worked for Korean governmental institutions that were dispatched for reconstruction projects and would have faced persecution if they remained. Thus, the Korean government made an apt decision in providing rescue in a timely manner. However, the government has referred to these Afghan nationals as special contributors rather than refugees, reflecting its desire to sidestep the hate against refugees held by parts of population. Instead of addressing anti-refugee sentiment, the government is reinforcing the stigmatization of refugees in this way. What the Afghan refugees kept being told by the Ministry of Justice throughout the resettlement process is that you should be proud of being referred to as special contributors rather than refugees because living as a refugee in Korea will give you a lot of disadvantages. Regardless of its political leanings, the Korean government has been failing in terms of refugee protection. Nothing has changed with refugee policies with the arrival of Yoon's administration. So it is unclear whether it will be better or worse than before in terms of refugee protection. That being said, there are two recent and symbolic events that reveal how the new administration views refugees. The first involved three Myanmar refugees who had been active in the pro-democracy movement after the recent coup and applied for refugee status upon arriving at an airport in Korea. Even though they should have been protected prima facie, the Ministry of Justice did not allow their entry and refused to process their applications. So they had to eat and sleep in the airport terminal for almost a month. The second event involved an announcement of the revised regulation concerning the treatment of migrant detainees. On May 25th, the Ministry of Justice revealed its plan to introduce more restrictive equipment for immigration detention, such as ankle cuffs, restraint beds, and restraint chairs, by revising the relevant regulation instead of the law. What makes this move more striking is that the announcement was what followed a recent incident where a detained asylum seeker was subjected to harsh treatment amounting to torture. The detainee, according to CCTV footage, while placed in solitary confinement, was forced to stay on his stomach for a prolonged period of time with his hands and legs tied with a rope behind his back and with his head trapped in a restraint. helmet. To conclude, to truly fulfill its commitment to refugee protection, the government of Korea must make drastic changes to its laws and policies on refugees in compliance with international standards and norms. For the specific recommendations for changes, please consult the written statement. I believe there's no country that is perfect in terms of refugee protection, and most nations are far from best practices. But it is important or even imperative for neighboring countries to monitor, encourage, and put pressure on each other for better protection of refugees. In this respect, I would like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk about the refugee policies of South Korea.
Mr. Kim, thank you so very much for your testimony and your recommendations. We will now ask Dr. Shin if he would present his testimony to the Commission.
Good morning and good evening, Chairman Smith and esteemed members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. Thank you for inviting me to speak at today's timely hearing. In 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK found that the gravity, scale, and nature of human rights violations in North Korea reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. Despite the tight control and severe punishment imposed by their own government, thousands of North Koreans have escaped abroad, risking forced repatriation by China, through which most of them make their way to South Korea, Europe, and the United States. Over 33,000 North Korean refugees have made their way to South Korea. The flight from a totalitarian regime to a liberal democracy is risky, but rewarding as they enjoy democracy, human rights, and the standard of life beyond their wildest dreams in North Korea. But sadly, the human rights plight of North Korean escapees does not end with their escape from North Korea or from China and Russia that forcibly repatriate them to North Korea in violation of the principle of non-refoulement under the UN Refugee Convention and Torture Convention, the principle that no one should be returned to a country where they face persecution or torture. Even in South Korea, where the vast majority of North Korean escapees are permanently settled, they are not safe from serious human rights violations, such as prolonged administrative detention and treatment that would qualify as torture under international law, as well as outright forced repatriation to North Korea. From October 2012 to April 2013, Liu Gario, an ethnic Korean Chinese national, was detained for 6 months and coerced to testify that her brother, Yu Sung, has been spying for North Korea. Since then, Mr. Yu has been acquitted of the espionage charges against him, while the intelligence officers and prosecutors who made the false accusation have been tried and convicted for abuse of power. On November 7, 2019, 2 North Koreans, known only by their family names Oh and Kim, who had arrived in South Korea by sea 5 days earlier, were blindfolded and driven to a location unknown to them, under the escort of a special police squad. When they were finally let off the vehicle and had their blindfold removed, they reportedly collapsed to their knees in terror at the sight before them. They found themselves at the joint security area, an inter-Korean contact point along the so-called demilitarized zone separating the 2 Koreas. Standing before them were North Korean officials who would take them into custody. When the incident became known to the public, totally by accident, the South Korean government claimed, with little proof, that the 2 had murdered over a dozen shipmates before escaping to North Korea, and that they did not genuinely intend to defect. There are 2 interrelated legal issues that make possible such egregious human rights violations against the North Korean escapees in South Korea. First, while the South Korean courts have consistently held that North Koreans are entitled to South Korean citizenship, despite the North Koreans in practice have at best an uncertain legal status under South Korean law. To be a full-fledged citizen in South Korea, one needs a family register. For an average South Korean, a register is created upon birth. But for a North Korean escapee, the register will be created only for a quote-unquote protected person, with the recommendation of the Minister of Unification. By law, such protection can be denied to North Korean escapees if they are felons, spies, or pose serious threats to national security. If the South Korean authorities deny the protected status for any of these reasons, the North Korean escapee in effect becomes a stateless person in a legal limbo. Ironically, their legal status can be worse than that of foreign nationals who are entitled to the due process, consular protection, and other rights under international law. The second issue concerns the legal basis and oversight of the interrogation and detention process for North Korean escapees. Because North Korean escapees are essentially beyond the pale of the law until they are granted the protective status, they are not afforded the minimum due process, like the right to an attorney or the right to remain silent. Because it is not a formal criminal process, the North Korean escapees lack the rights accorded to the criminal suspects, and they can be subject to removal or expulsion without refugee or extradition proceedings. Such prolonged administrative detention of North Korean escapees without periodic judicial review is a blatant violation of the right to personal liberty. The condition of secret and incommunicado detention may even arise to enforce its appearance, and their ill treatment amount to torture under international law. And the forced repatriation of North Korean escapees to North Korea, where they face torture, enforced disappearance, and executions, violate South Korea's obligations under international law. I am not trying to downplay the risk of North Korean infiltration or espionage. Pyongyang has sent its agents disguised as North Korean refugees in the past, and it will continue to likely to do so. However, the current system does not take into account the greatly reduced level of active hostilities with North Korea, the massive increase in the inflow of North Korean escapees, and South Korea's democratic moves since the 1990s. While the ambiguous legal status of the North Korean escapees in South Korea's domestic legal order and the extra-legal nature of their detention and interrogation by the intelligence services enable various human rights violations and abuses, there are specific political reasons that such violations and abuses occur. Individual intelligence officers, either out of political ambition or unscrupulousness, have incentives to wrongly accuse North Korean escapees of being Pyongyang's agents, and the escapees with little legal protection during the initial interrogation and detention phase are particularly vulnerable. Worse yet, a far more shocking form of abuse reared its head under the previous progressive government of President Moon Jae-in, a human rights lawyer, ironically. President Moon made the improvement of inter-Korean relationship the cornerstone of his presidency, but his policy has been criticized as unprincipled appeasement of a hereditary dictator with few tangible results. Indeed, the Moon administration enacted a law banning the unauthorized sending of not only leaflets, but also USBs and books to North Korea after Pyongyang threatened retaliation. When the North Korean Navy executed Lee Dae-jun, an unarmed South Korean citizen that drifted into North Korean controlled waters, reportedly as part of its brutal COVID-19 quarantine measures in September 28, 2020, the Moon administration did its best to direct the blame away from Pyongyang, even making a dubious claim that he tried to defect to North Korea. It is not clear why the Moon government decided to forcibly return the two North Korean escapees on November 7, 2019, just 5 days after their arrival. But there have been speculations that it was a part of a charm offensive to induce Kim Jong-un to attend the ASEAN-South Korea summit meeting in Busan held later that month. If that is indeed the case, it was all in vain as Kim failed to show up in Busan. It is ironic and remarkable that the ambitious intelligence agents and unprincipled politicians who occupy polar opposites in the political spectrum both abuse the precarious legal position of North Korean defectors and unchecked detention integration powers to their political advantage. Unfortunately, this is not the first or only instance where the political expedience has trumped the principled stance on universal human rights in the inter-Korean relationship. With respect to the POWs and civilian abductees held in North Korea, which number in at least tens of thousands, the South Korean government chose to forget about them or blame them for disloyalty, while their family members in South Korea have been subject to surveillance as potential fifth columnists. The South Korean government even denied for decades the existence of South Korean POWs during the Vietnam War, despite receiving information about at least 18 soldiers, Marines, and civilian contractors from the US authorities in the early 1970s. My organization, the Transitional Justice Working Group, believes that the legal reform with respect to North Korean escapees in South Korea is necessary, regardless of who is in power. First, concerning the legal status of North Korean refugee escapees arriving in South Korea, the law must clarify that they are entitled to South Korean citizenship as a matter of right, provided they freely express a permanent allegiance to the Republic of Korea. While attempting to infiltrate South Korea as agents of the North Korean state would be grounds for disqualification, alleged past criminal activities prior to entering South Korea cannot be. Such previous criminal offenses must be addressed in South Korean courts, as would be the case for any other South Korean citizens. Second, the primary authority for the interrogation of North Korean escapees, as well as a detention facility, should be transferred from the intelligence services to the Ministry of Justice. While it may be necessary for the intelligence agents to be involved in interrogation of North Korean escapees, there is little justification for the intelligence services to oversee the entire process. The intelligence agents may take part in the interviews and take a proactive role when there is probable cause to suspect espionage. The Justice Ministry, despite the problems that Attorney Kim just mentioned, already handles the processing of foreign migrants and asylum seekers, as well as the detention centers. Third, the process for interrogation and detention of North Korean escapees should be clearly defined in law. The existing law detailing the processing of foreign migrants and asylum seekers can be incorporated into law for North Korean escapees. In particular, the due process guarantees according to criminal suspects, duration and judicial review of prolonged administrative detention, and the principle of non-refoulement must be codified by an act of National Assembly. As explained above, the existing legal system for North Korean escapees arriving in South Korea is in need of fundamental reform. This is necessary to prevent future human rights violations against North Korean defectors by the South Korean authorities. It requires a rethink of North Korean escapees as people fleeing persecution who are entitled to full South Korean citizenship, rather than pawns in the political game with North Korea. The South Korean authorities also need to come clean about the past human rights violations against North Korean escapees. The intelligence agents responsible for Yoon Sung case have been convicted or are currently on trial, while his family has won compensation claims against the governing court. The South Korean government should also review the forced repatriation of the 2 North Korean escapees in November 2019. There can be no excuse for sending back North Koreans who sought refuge and expressed their intent to live in South Korea to their certain deaths in North Korea. A full inquiry should be conducted, and those responsible for this monstrous decision should be held accountable. The South Korean government should also make public the name of the 2 North Korean escapees, inquire North Korea about their fate and whereabouts, and call for their rights to be respected. If South Korea does not respect the principle of non-refoulement, it will be difficult for us to insist upon China and Russia to do the same. The new Yoon administration has been moving to reinvestigate the 2019 forced repatriation of the 2 North Koreans. And this Monday, as Susan Schulte just informed, has shared information with us, this Monday, Park Sang-hak of the Fighters for Free North Korea filed criminal complaints for complicity in murder and abuse of power against President Moon's national security advisor and intelligence chief, who reportedly made a decision to repatriate the 2 North Koreans. President Yoon should also follow up by making lasting legal and institutional reforms. In conclusion, the North Korean escapees have suffered enough, first in their country of birth and later in China and other transit states. The least that South Korea, which in theory views North Koreans as its full-fledged citizens under its constitution, can do is to avoid compounding their sufferings and to guarantee their fundamental human rights. Thank you.
Dr. Shin, thank you very much for that very comprehensive and incisive testimony. Deeply appreciate it. And now I would like to recognize Dr. Son for his testimony.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Smith, and all panelists and attendees. It's my great honor to join such a meaningful event today. My name is Moon Jun-son, working as a faculty neurosurgeon at a university hospital, living in Seoul. Before I begin my testimony, I would like to confess today that, unlike other excellent panelists here, I lived as an ordinary citizen who was indifferent to refugee policy and issues until July last year. I'm humbled to say that this gathering has given me time to find the reflection and insight into what I used to be. In November 2009, South Korea has decided to join OECD Development Assistance Committee in Paris as a 21st member, becoming an advanced donor in international committee. Subsequently, in 2010, the Korean government's largest ODA project began in Afghanistan. And Inje University and Bank Medical Center signed a PMC contract with KOICA to take the lead in humanitarian medical aid project. KOICA is a government funded organization such as USAID in United States. I also decided to participate in PRT hospital project as the second sabbatical year of my life. It was a coincidental motivation and gradually became the inevitable reality of today's as a destiny. I happened to have a joining PRT mission in Afghanistan between 2010 and 11 and connected with them, people in Afghanistan, co-workers, friends, patients, and their families. After returning from dispatch to daily life, it remains a special memory. Last year, however, all of a sudden, Afghanistan was quickly being conquered by Taliban again. The urgent voice of our Afghan friends who worked with us 12 years ago and threats they faced, and the vivid violence reported in media broadcast brought back a vivid bad memory of the past about the terrorism committed by Taliban during the dispatch period. Meanwhile, the Afghan local staff contacted me. I raised their voice to the Korean government officers. Eventually, the evacuation mission has been done by the Korean government. The local staff was in contact with me during the entire process of the evacuation and the settlement for discussion and mentoring. The Korean government made a lot of efforts and provide opportunities for their settlement and initial adaptation to the new society compared to the past. Now I started singing Refugee. In particular, from last year, I have come to realize the need for participation and inclusive laws of ordinary citizens. Now it has become an important challenge in my life. After all, I'm working for Real Friend, which NGO supporting social settlement of refugees and migrants in Korea. Criticism of Korea's refugee policy has long been raised by meaningful activists and pioneers. Only a few years ago, accepting Yemeni refugees on Jeju Island located in south part of Korea was a hot issue in Korean society. At that time, the media reports and public opinion presented a negative perception of refugees in our society. Only now, from the perspective of human rights, a more objective and reasonable consensus on the issue of accepting refugees is actively forming in Korean society. In terms of South Korea's refugee policy and the new administration, I believe that our society is at an important turning point to development into a multicultural immigrant society with a stance of accepting and welcoming refugees and also committed to international standards, including the principle of non-refoulement and implementation of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Korea's refugee policy is still in the stage of baby stepping. So there seems to be a lot to learn from foreign cases and a lot to supplement. I think we should find ways to communicate with the civil society and the government. There are mixed feelings within civil society regarding the establishment of the immigration agents. We believe the installation of an agency alone does not solve the problem. And what's the more urgent is to take legislative measures and make the inclusive immigration policy. Measures to accept a refugee in crisis as our members should be discussed, and culture and awareness of a multicultural society should also be promoted. This means that it is a need to make some legislative amendment for a better and more inclusive immigration policy and its acceptance. I hope that today's meeting could encourage the member states of the 1951 Refugee Convention to take appropriate steps to adopt and fulfill their obligation and to develop a national refugee policy for better compliance with provision of the convention. In addition, this gathering and reports are expected to serve as an opportunity to take an important step toward the development of the new Korean government refugee policy and improvement of awareness of Korean civil society. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Schoen, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for effectuating the freedom of so many people who otherwise would have had a terrible ordeal. They already had one, but it would have been much worse. So thank you for that in Afghanistan. And I've been to Catholic University in Seoul. I wish I would have met you, but I just want to thank you for your tremendous contribution to life and to health, and for helping us today with your insights. I'd like to now recognize Suzanne Schulte, a friend who's, I didn't mention this, but I remember at one point Suzanne brought in at least 25 North Korean defectors, and we met for hours hearing their stories about how they loved freedom and the ability to practice their faith. And it was an amazing conversation. So, Suzanne Schulte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Smith. And I remember that meeting very well. We were bringing you a portrait that was made by two brothers in Pyongyang, hand woven in silk, that got smuggled out of the country. If they had been caught making that, they would have been executed. And they sent it out with a message: please tell the congressman there's people in a dark place that still have hope. And because of people like you that are standing up for the suffering people in the world, those two brothers did that. And that's where that was an amazing meeting. And we walked out of there, those North Koreans thought you were the greatest person they'd ever met. So
they're the greatest, and you're the greatest. Yeah.
Anyway, well, I'm very, very grateful for the attention that you're paying today on the hundreds of North Korean refugees that are in grave peril in detention in China right now. And I'm fervently hoping that that China will act in accordance with its international treaty obligations, and that South Korea will act in accordance with its constitution to expeditiously resettle these refugees who are citizens of South Korea under the South Korean Constitution. I wanted to start out with a hopeful thing to share. A family of 4 recently arrived safely in South Korea directly from China because of the cooperation between 2 nations and a lot of prayer. And the family sent this photo. If you can see that. The family sent this photo for this hearing and agreed to allow me to submit their testimony to you that was written by the mother, Mrs. Kim, which I have added to my testimony and submitted that for the Tom Lantos.
Without objection, it will all be made a part of the record, as well as any other extraneous or extra information our witnesses would like to add to the record.
Super. This is an example before us that there's no reason why all those seeking resettlement should not be safely resettled tomorrow. While I'm very grateful for the rescue of these 4, I want to appeal to the Yoon administration to save the rest. Send a plane or 2, like has been done before when the Korean government sent a plane to rescue 486 North Korean refugees out of another communist country in Southeast Asia. So it can be done. And when I say tomorrow, I'm serious. The North Korean refugee crisis can be solved overnight if China upheld its treaty obligations, because these are refugees that are citizens of South Korea already. There's not a problem with getting resettled somewhere, and they've been welcomed in other countries all over the world, including the United States. According to Unification Hope Mission, Of the 1,200 North Koreans detained now, 600 are children, women, and men who were trying to get to South Korea. That desire alone is grounds for execution, and all North Koreans repatriated face certain torture, certain detention, and potential execution. Those like the Kim family who escaped from COVID could have only done this if they were party members with resources or had family in South Korea that sent them financial support. Because of that, this family faced torture and execution if they had been sent back. I do want to recognize the kindness of the Chinese guards in the prison where the father was kept with the oldest son and the detention center where the mother was kept with their youngest son for 7 months. Neither one of them knew how the other was doing, but they were shown compassion and kindness by these Chinese guards. So I just want to point out that Xi Jinping is responsible for these cruel and illegal repatriations, not the Chinese people. Right now is the greatest opportunity because North Korea's border is closed and not accepting refugees. And we saw the horrible murder of a South Korean maritime official last year who was approaching the border. They shot him and they burned his body. That's how much they've tried to close their border. So the border is sealed. China can't force these refugees back because the border is still closed. And another significant part that makes this so such an important opportunity is that China has allowed safe passage for refugees, especially to show their displeasure with North Korea's nuclear launches and missile testing, or I'm sorry, nuclear program and their missile launches. And they're on a steady campaign right now of doing just those very things that are so provocative. So how has the policy of outgoing President Moon Jae-in impacted North Korean refugees? The career South Korean officials I have dealt with have been terrific. They have done everything they could to respond to me every time I had information on refugees needing help. We have agonized together over those lost, and we rejoice together over those saved. But for those appointed by Moon, that was not the case. Moon was more interested in pleasing the Kim dictatorship, and I feel a large part of this is because the defectors were having the most significant impact of reaching the people of North Korea with the truth. The North Koreans in South Korea were winning the information campaign by getting information to North Korea by every means possible, by land, by sea, and by air. They dedicated themselves to freeing the people of North Korea with the power of truth, and their mantra became, "The truth will set them free." And peaceful change in North Korea from dictatorship to democracy can be accomplished without weapons, but with words. In response, Moon launched an aggressive campaign at the direct orders of Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong to cut off all the successful works of the North Korean-led NGOs that had partnered with the South Koreans' entities. Stopping the North Korean escapees was part of this, because the escapees sharing their testimonies led all the world to know the truth of the crimes against humanity of the Kim regime. Now the Republic of Korea should be highly praised for their successful efforts in resettling over 33,826 refugees as of this week. This is a huge challenge, as most North Koreans arrive in South Korea with post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who will tell you they had the value of a fly in North Korea have often been subjected to human trafficking, as the Congressman Smith referenced, and the children arrive with little to no education. But given the proper assistance, they can thrive and lead productive and meaningful lives. I met a young North Korean recently who defected because he heard then President Park Geun-hye say that all North Koreans were welcome to come to South Korea so they could follow their dreams. And so he did, and so did so many others. President Park's exact words, "South Korea will always leave the path open so the people of North Korea can find hope and life. The people of North Korea can always come to South Korea where freedom prospers." But when Moon Jae-in became president of South Korea, all of that changed. His administration repatriated North Korean refugees in violation of both the South Korean Constitution and their international treaty obligations, as Mr. Shim pointed out earlier. He pulled out the welcome mat and slammed the door in their faces, and in my face too. At the South Korean Embassy in Washington, D.C. on April 30th, 2021, I initially had the door slammed in my face when I was hand-delivering a letter signed by 23 former U.S. government officials representing every president of the United States since Richard Nixon. Signers included Special Envoy for North Korea Human Rights Robert King, who served President Obama, and Jay Lefkowitz, who served for President Bush. With that letter from those officials, we hand-delivered the photos of these families, the individual pictures of the children and the moms and the dads that were in prison in China. We hand-delivered those photos to the embassy, and we said, if you don't act, these people will be killed. In addition, in a shocking betrayal, the Moon administration revoked the passport of a South Korean businessman who was helping North Koreans. By any other human rights standard, this man was a hero. But because he was arrested by the Chinese and put in prison for helping North Koreans, the Moon administration invalidated his passport, claiming he damaged the national prestige. He was saving people's lives. My recommendation to the Yoon administration is to send a plane and bring those North Korean children, women, and men to a place where they can follow their dreams. It is the North Koreans living in freedom in South Korea that gave President Yoon his margin of victory, the closest margin of victory in South Korean presidential politics. The North Koreans living in South Korea gave him his margin of victory in this recent election because it was a matter of freedom and life in South Korea or repatriation and death in North Korea. In closing, I want to quote from Mrs. Kim's testimony. She told her children, because of the extreme danger of crossing the border to escape, she said, it would be great if we could just take a plane to South Korea instead of crossing the borders. Her children thought that was impossible. But even when they were arrested, interrogated, and shackled, she believed that with God, all things are possible, as she had become a devout Christian. And she told her children, God will soon send us to South Korea after a while in prison, but we won't have to cross the border. And God did just that. They came by plane directly from China to South Korea. So I conclude with a two-word quote from the Kim family. I asked them, because they were in good circumstances. She had a good position in North Korea. There was no reason why she had to flee. And she said, when she replied to me, when I said, why did you leave North Korea for South Korea? And she said, for freedom. So thank you very much, Congressman.
Suzanne, thank you so very much for your testimony. You have the people of Korea, and that includes the people of North Korea, have no better friend, advocate who has been so effective over decades than you. I can't thank you enough. You have informed members of Congress, House and Senate, and so many others, mobilized all of us, and I can't thank you enough for the work that you have done and continue to do. And thank you for your very practical recommendations today, including the plane. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Kizuka for his testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Smith and distinguished members of the Commission and this panel. On behalf of Human Rights First, I thank you for the opportunity to testify. With global displacement at record levels, it is imperative that all countries meet international obligations to protect and welcome people forced from their homes, the vast majority of whom are hosted by neighboring countries. For example, nearly 3.8 million Syrian and other refugees are hosted by Turkey, 1.8 million Venezuelans are displaced in Colombia, 1.5 million South Sudanese and other refugees are in Uganda, and the more than 150,000 Nicaraguan refugees in Costa Rica make up fully 3% of that country's population. As a norm of customary international law, all countries are bound to respect the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, which prohibits countries from returning people to persecution or torture. In addition, the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol, the Convention Against Torture, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights enshrine this and other core protections for asylum seekers, including the principle of non-discrimination and the prohibition against arbitrary detention. Yet today, many countries fail to live up to these obligations. Dozens of countries have not ratified the Refugee Convention or its protocol, including India, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Refugees in these countries, including Rohingya, Tibetan, and Uyghur peoples, cannot apply for or receive refugee recognition from national authorities, leaving them vulnerable to pushbacks, arrests, detention, and deportation. In recent years, Thailand and Vietnam have deported North Korean defectors at the request of the North Korean government. At the same time, countries that have by joining the convention or its protocol are flagrantly violating these obligations. They are illegally pushing refugees away at borders or forcibly returning them to grave danger. As we've heard, Chinese authorities have deported North Korean refugees back to North Korea, where Human Rights Watch reported they faced torture, imprisonment, sexual violence, and forced labor. But also recent US policies have barred refugees from countries including Cameroon, Cuba, El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela from asylum because they had crossed through a third country. Return asylum seekers to wait in danger in Mexico for US asylum proceedings, and have used the pandemic as a pretext to block asylum at ports of entry and along the border. Human Rights First has tracked more than 10,000 reports of murder, kidnapping, rape, and other violence against people blocked in or expelled to Mexico due to that Title 42 policy since January 2021 alone. In the European Union, Italy and other countries continue to return asylum seekers and migrants to Libya, where a UN investigation documented evidence that authorities commit crimes against humanity, including against migrants. Some countries' refugee determination systems are not fairly extending protection to people unable to return home because of the persecution they face. Since 1982, when Japan enacted its refugee protocols, only 915 people have been recognized as refugees out of nearly 90,000 requests, just 1%. Failures to timely and accurately decide cases leave refugees in legal and psychological limbo, facing potential deportation to their country of persecution. Discrimination and disparate treatment of refugees based on nationality, race, religion, and other characteristics remain serious problems. For instance, the United States recently moved rapidly to receive tens of thousands of Ukrainians at the southern border and through an expedited parole process. But by comparison, people from third countries fleeing Ukraine are not eligible for that program. More than 90% of adjudicated requests from Afghans for US humanitarian parole have been denied, and the United States has used Title 42 to expel tens of thousands of Haitians, including many asylum seekers, to Haiti, despite escalating political violence. Similarly, the welcome reception in Poland of many people fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine stands in stark contrast to the racist treatment by some Polish officials of African, South Asian, and Middle Eastern nationals attempting to flee Ukraine, and the abuse Kurdish, Syrian, and other asylum seekers faced when crossing from Belarus in 2021. According to Amnesty International, these refugees were subjected to arbitrary detention, forcible sedation, and tasering as they were expelled from Poland. Other countries, including Australia and the United States, routinely subject people in search of refuge to prolonged and arbitrary detention, often in abysmal conditions. Instead of penalizing and attempting to deter people from requesting refugee protection through the use of immigration detention, these and other governments should employ proven and effective community-based case support services. As the United States rightly encourages other countries to uphold international law and welcome people in search of refuge, it should push for an end to policies that deny refugees an opportunity to apply for asylum, return them to danger, subject them to mass detention, discriminate on the basis of nationality, race, or other factors, and unfairly reject their applications for asylum. But to credibly and effectively call on other countries to continue to welcome and host the vast majority of the world's refugees, whether they are fleeing North Korea, China, Ukraine, Haiti, or Venezuela, and to push those countries to respect international law, including at their borders, the United States must do the same. So we urge Congress to ensure that the United States' treatment of people seeking asylum complies with its longstanding domestic refugee laws and the fundamental international obligations we are here to discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. There are a series of recorded votes on the floor of the House, which will regrettably cause us not to be able to ask a lot of questions. As a matter of fact, it's on zero in terms of me and my colleagues having to get over to the floor. But I would like to first thank Joan Kim, Giorgini Agostini, John Kim, Piero Tazzi, on our staff that have, Joan Kim did an outstanding job with this hearing, but more importantly, with the follow-up as well as everything that predated it. We're hoping for major, major changes by the new government, as well as investigations. You mentioned, Mr. Kim, dramatic changes are needed, and perhaps they could be done some by executive order or some kind of decree, and others obviously have to be done through the legislature. So I do thank all of you for your incredible recommendations, which we will follow up on. I don't hold hearings and then walk away and say, been there, done that. We follow up aggressively, whether it be with legislation and of course with diplomacy. So, but I would like to just ask again, maybe Dr. Shin, if you could just take a moment. We were all shocked and dismayed when the Moon government sent those two fishermen back in November of 2019 to a horrible fate. I'm not sure, maybe you can enlighten us as to whether or not they are dead. Do we have any sense as to, we know they will be maltreated with absolute malice by Kim Jong-un. That's what they do. They perfected the art of torture. They're parallel, of course, with the Chinese Communist Party's use of torture. But they are, so what has happened to those men? And again, what would you call on this government to do? I think there needs to be, and you did reference it in your testimony, a very serious investigation, how that could happen, because that is antithetical to everything about human rights. You know, I read a lot of laws on refugees and on human rights. And when I saw that back then, I couldn't believe it, that a man who purported to be a human rights lawyer could have his administration send people back to a horrific fate. So Dr. Shin, if you could just maybe touch on that. And then I would ask all of you, if you would, if you want to make any final comment, the record will be open and then the hearing will be adjourned. So Dr. Shin?
Thank you, Congressman Smith, for the question. So everything with North Korea, it's very difficult to really find out what's happening within the country, including the fate of those two North Korean defectors. And unfortunately, the Moon government really had not shown much interest in following up on the fate of these two individuals. Now, I understand that the new Yoon administration will first start with the, like I said, the reinvestigation of what had happened in November 2019. My NGO, TJWG, has made submissions to the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korean human rights. And the Special Rapporteur has actually sent letters to both the South Korean government and the North Korean government asking about asking, especially with North Korea, the fate of the two North Koreans. Unfortunately, North Korea government has not responded to the UN Special Rapporteur's letter. So it's a very difficult case to follow up. However, I think it's important for the UN administration to continue to put diplomatic pressure at the UN and also in the bilateral talks with Pyongyang to continue to raise this issue based on the factual and legal findings of its own reinvestigation.
I thank you. You know, I would also just add, and this is regards to North Koreans who think escaping into China sometime is a good thing. I had asked many, many times when he was the High Commissioner for Refugees, Gutierrez, who is obviously the Secretary General of the UN. I met with him here, I met with him in New York and elsewhere, and asked him to use his good office to help these North Koreans, and he did nothing. I said, you know, the Chinese government are signatories and ratifiers of the Refugee Convention, so there is a solemn obligation. And certainly as the High Commissioner, he was in a very, very good position, strategic position, to be of assistance, and he did nothing. I will never forget it. I pleaded with him. I remember at one particular meeting, I said, if not you, who? And he did nothing. So, you know, the Koreans have suffered so much at the hands of a dictatorship, and of course, to send people who have defected from South Korea back to North Korea for a cruel fate is unconscionable. So I do thank you. If others would like to make a comment, and
If I may, I just want to add for the record something that Susan actually had forwarded to me through from Park Sang-hak. And Mr. Park actually mentioned that when those two North Koreans were sent back in November 2019, that the U.S. and South Korean soldiers guarding the post at the JSA actually took pictures of those two individuals being taken back to North Korea, and that those photos are probably in the possession of both the South Korean government and also the U.S. government. So if those photos could be made public, I think that's another way to put pressure on North Korea as well.
Yeah, Congressman Smith,
Yes.
it's Suzanne.
Who's that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, those photos are, we have those photos, and as Mr. Shim said, the defectors have taken action on this to pursue it. And I do want to point out how important it is to speak out about these issues. And I want to cite a specific case. When I talk about South Korean officials I've worked with and we've agonized together. There was an agonizing case of 9 orphans that were on their way to Korea. They got to Laos, and the government at that time was it was during the Sunshine Policy, and they didn't act quickly enough, and the North Koreans intervened and took those 9 orphans. These are 9 orphan children, and they were sent back. So by the 3 countries conspiring together to send those children back to death. And we know that the oldest of the group, the 2 oldest of the group were killed. But because we had a press conference in Congress demanding to know how they were doing, we think it saved the lives of the 7, because they were shown on video living glorious lives back home in the great fatherland of Kim Jong. I think it was Kim Jong-un at the time. And so it's really important, because I think that saved their lives, because they knew they couldn't just, But also, I'm hoping that in addition to saving the refugees, that the Yoon administration will relaunch the information campaign, rice bottle launches,
Yes.
getting in leaflets, the balloon launches, getting in shortwave radios that across the border, all these things that were happening, because I really believe that the defectors were winning that war. And we see it all the time when we interview people. Why do they risk their lives to do something so dangerous? And it's because they know that these things have power and influence. And one other quick thing you'll appreciate. This is an example of a rice bottle. The defectors the Moon government has made it illegal for them to send in information, which from the last hearing goes against their international treaty obligations. You can't stop somebody from imparting information across borders. And the defectors never stopped, Congressman Smith. They never stopped. They kept doing it. And the South Korean Navy found one of these, turned it into the police, investigated my dearest brother, Kim Sung-min, who you know, because he was the one that was behind it. But they never did anything. And you know why? Because in that rice bottle was a flash drive of messages of hope and encouragement from members of Congress, Democrat and Republicans and members of Congress, including you, to the people of North Korea, sharing their hopes and dreams for their freedom and their human rights. And so those police realized if they arrest this guy for getting messages from members of Congress, including Senator Chris Coons, who's very close friends with our president, President Biden, they knew that they couldn't pursue it, and they didn't, and they haven't. So we have to keep speaking out and using our voices. So I just wanted to share that.
And when we had that hearing, the pushback from the Moon government was very, very dramatic pushback. And we said, I've been in Congress now 42 years. I've been to political prisons all over the world, including in China, Beijing prison number 1, the gulags in the former Soviet Union, in Jakarta, name the place. We tried to get to the actual prison camps and gulags and concentration camps. I'd love to go to the ones in Xinjiang if we could ever get access to them because of the terrible, despicable genocide being committed by Xi Jinping. But that said, what I've learned is information is the greatest sense of hope that individuals get. Václav Havel and other great leaders used to say, because of Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia now in China, into that part of the world, even the BBC, that when that information comes in, it gives them hope. So the information going across the border was giving hope and accurate information rather than the propaganda lies that are coming out of Pyongyang. So, I was shocked, and I actually put together a hearing right here in this room, meeting with some individuals, and we talked to you as well. We said, we've got to start bringing some attention to this. How dare they limit the flow of information, and again, to have embedded in their messages from Congress. That's very interesting. Hopefully they'll put this hearing into some of those messages to let them know we haven't forgotten the people who are suffering so much under the Kim Jong-un and that dynasty.
I can promise you this will be broadcast. What happened here today will be broadcast into North Korea on Free North Korea Radio. That I can promise you.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you. You know, just one other thing on that, when I grew up, and it stuck with me forever, when we were combating the egregious human rights violations of the Soviet Union, and again, I worked on that much of my life as well, and of course under Putin it's gotten bad as well, Ukraine. But I remember the famous statement, the Iron Curtain isn't soundproof. You know, it was a public service ad that used to go out talking about how important Radio Free Europe is. Ditto for Radio Free Asia, ditto for all the other Voice of America to get, and of course your efforts to get that vital information. It says in the Bible, without hope, people perish. And you need hope and you need information. And again, to criminalize that like Moon's government did, and then to initiate a prosecution is outrageous. So thank you.
If you allowed me, I'd like
Sure.
to
Please.
speak in
Mr. Kim.
final words. Yeah. I'd like to urge the Korean government to pay attention to 60 Chinese refugees in Jeju Island. They are struggling. The government should pay attention to the suffering facing these refugees, and they are under the threat of de facto deportation, and so they should be resettled to another country like the United States, or they should be protected as refugees.
We know.
And the other day, I had chance to talk with old friend from Afghanistan who resettled recently. Uh, According to him, you know, not a single person from these resettled Afghan refugees, you know, their vocational career and education were properly recognized here. So they contributed, you know, uh, with their education and vocational talent to Korean governmental institution back in Afghanistan. But now here in Korea, the government did not give them chance to contribute, you know, ironically, to Korean society. This, you know, has been happening to all other refugees. So, you know, the government, you know, should you know, think that, you know, refugee should be protected in compliance with international standard, and should give them chance to contribute to Korean society with their talent and education. Thank you.
We really are out of time, and I deeply apologize to any further comments some of you would like to make. We're on 0, and I'm missing this vote, so I can't miss any more votes. I thank you so much, and my colleagues who have joined us today, but I thank our very distinguished witnesses. You've given us a path forward. I appreciate it. Hearing's adjourned.